3 years ago, Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart published a paper that quickly became one of the most famous, most talked about economics papers since the financial crisis. It got so much attention because it answered a basic question everybody was asking. How much debt is too much?
And this was a question that was being talked about constantly. The European debt crisis was in the news all the time. In the U.S., we were debating, as we still are, what to do about the deficit. Did we need more stimulus money? And these two professors, Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart, offered a very specific way to think about government debt. They had a number, 90%, a debt to GDP ratio of 90%. They said this was an important line. Countries with debt above that threshold, their economies grew much, much slower than countries that stayed below it, which was an interesting idea, that there is this threshold that matters a lot. And that idea was all over the news after the study came out. And we here at Planet Money, we had Ken Rogoff on to talk about it. It was on news shows and newspapers. Lots of people cited it.
And policymakers started citing this too. In the U.S., you heard Paul Ryan talking about this study when he argued for the U.S. to cut its deficit. In Europe, policymakers there cited it in arguing for austerity, for cutting deficits in Europe.
And then, a couple months ago, a 28-year-old graduate student in economics at UMass Amherst got what seemed like a totally routine assignment for one of his classes. He was supposed to pick a published study and replicate it. Basically, get all the data the authors got, do the math that they did, and show how they got their results.
His name was Thomas Herndon, and he chose this Rogoff and Reinhart paper. He got the basic data on growth and debt, a lot of which the authors themselves had posted online, and he started crunching the numbers.
It was a few weeks, maybe a month into the semester, and I run just the first basic thing of taking the average, and this is the basic statistics, and they didn't match at all. I was like, oh no, I must have made some gross error. That doesn't look at all like what they cited.
Herndon went to his professors, and they were like, come on, this is not even supposed to be the hard part, right? You're just taking an average. You're doing something wrong. Just figure it out. So Herndon goes back. He keeps checking everything. And he keeps getting a really different answer than what Reinhart and Rogoff got. Eventually, he emails Reinhart and Rogoff because he wants to get the spreadsheet where they actually did their work, right? He wants to know if there's some kind of difference of opinion, or did Reinhart and Rogoff actually do the math wrong or something?
And Carmen Reinhart wrote him back and said, here you go. Here is an attached spreadsheet of our original math.
I was in the middle of writing a different paper, and I just immediately stopped, opened up the spreadsheet, and that's when I saw the error in the average. I almost didn't believe my eyes. I had to ask my girlfriend to look at it for me to see if I wasn't just, just wrong.
He wasn't wrong. The authors of one of the most influential economics papers of recent years had made a simple Excel error. Herndon, with the help of his professors, published his findings this week. And as soon as they hit the internet, it seemed like everybody in America who pays attention to economics was talking about what this 28-year-old grad student had discovered.
All right, a hot topic in the world of economics, Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff. Their famous study claims countries see their debt-to-GDP ratio climb above 90%, and growth then slows dramatically.
A team of researchers from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst has found basic errors in Reinhart and Rogoff's work.
What do you make of the Reinhart-Rogoff controversy?
Look, I haven't audited the now famous spreadsheet, but others have, apparently.
So we have a Harvard mistake here, and has that mistake led us down the wrong road to a Harvard austerity?
He thought he was the king of America, where they bought Coca-Cola, just like this.
Hello and welcome to Planet Money. I'm Jacob Goldstein.
And I'm Clara Jaffe-Waltz. On the show today, we've got a famous economics study with a basic spreadsheet error, which raises some questions like, just what are we supposed to make of that? How much should we trust the economic research that we look to and cite and talk about? And how much should we trust economists?
It was a fine idea at the time. Now it's a
Before we get to those big questions, let's just spend a couple minutes talking about the details of what Thomas Herndon found. Besides that error in the spreadsheet, He also noticed that Reinhart and Rogoff left out some data and weighted the countries in a way that seemed weird to him. And Herndon says if you don't do those things, you find that, yeah, average growth is slower in countries where debt is over 90%. But you do not see the big, scary drop-off that Reinhart and Rogoff found. The threshold just is not there. And that threshold, the idea that there was this line you hit at 90%, that was largely why the Reinhart and Rogoff paper was such a big deal in the first place.
We did reach out to Reinhart and Rogoff. They declined our request for an interview, but they put out a statement this week. And in the statement, they defended the way they weighted the countries. They said they were constantly updating their database, and Thomas Herndon was able to use some data that wasn't ready when they wrote their paper back in 2010.
But Reinhart and Rogoff said they did make that simple error in Excel. They wrote, quote, "It is sobering that such an error slipped into one of our papers despite our best efforts to be consistently careful. We will redouble our efforts to avoid such errors in the future."
So the very first simple question we wanted to ask was just, how often does this happen? How often are economic studies just wrong?
You find mistakes in many, many papers.
This is Justin Wolfers. He's an economist at the University of Michigan.
Finding errors is not rare.
Finding errors 3 years later for a very important paper, that's not rare?
I can tell you I've been through I've replicated every single paper in the death penalty literature, and I found errors in 90% of them, anywhere between 1 month and 10 years later.
Wow. Really?
Yeah, that seems like a big deal.
So, I mean, just in the death penalty case, those were certainly papers that were written about probably by journalists, by policy people who would cite a study to bolster some claim that
they were written about by the Supreme Court, and they were cited in congressional testimony.
Now, some of what Wolfers is calling errors here are questions about methodology, things reasonable people might disagree on. But in other cases, he says, people just screwed up the math.
Yeah. In one case, it changed an author's estimate from a claim that each execution deters 18 homicides to instead each execution causes another 18 homicides.
He got the sign wrong.
Completely wrong.
Now, the authors of that study have responded to Wolfers, but essentially what Justin Wolfers is telling us here is our question, should we be worried about economic studies? Yes. He says there may be other famous papers where people just got the math wrong.